As we kick off, please don't let the talking of this guy who finds himself living in Minnesota but growing up in South Africa distract you from your lunch. But as a backdrop, we thought it would be good basis for the Q&A session that will follow to just give you a little bit of a glimpse behind the curtain of what the research really uncovered. As a caveat before we kind of dig into it, I do feel like this is the starting point of a conversation of how we need to think about this missing middle skill set that's required as intelligent technology and human ingenuity start to come together. And so this by no means is going to give the silver lining, silver bullet, here's the answer. But I think it's a start of an important conversation where the private sector, academia, and society really do need to start coming together to solve for some of these really complex challenges and problems. So with that, Nicholas Wittall, based out of Minneapolis. I also, within Accenture, lead our future workforce practice. And over the last several years, I've spent a lot of my time with some of our largest clients really addressing and figuring out their complex talent strategies and talent challenges. So some of the trends that are on screen right now are some of the trends that we're observing, but not trends in the distant future perspective. And just to give you an idea, I've been doing a lot of work with a retailer looking at the massive implication that automation is going to have on their store's workforce. Working with a multinational organization in 103 countries, one of the most complex organizations in the world, thinking about what is the ethical application of AI within their workforce. So just because they can, should they automate a plant in Chile that would see an entire community's ecosystem and economy displaced? Working with a technology company in just north of Indianapolis who's looking to hire 2,000 engineers. And I'll cut to the punchline. There are not 2,000 engineers in this small town that this company exists and operates. And so how are they figuring that out? And just yesterday was with a CHRO at one of the biggest life sciences companies thinking about how does he take consumer-grade customer experience and turn it inwards to the organization to really start to drive a stronger employee experience. And so these trends, I think, are important for us to keep an eye on, but more importantly, they're actually things that our clients within Accenture and within corporate America are certainly starting to try to figure out. And there's no simple solution to that. So digging into the research a little bit now, what we mean by this missing middle is where intelligent technology and human ingenuity really start to come together. And within that missing middle, there is this bank of activities or tasks or work that will be led by humans in support of machines, and there'll be work that is led by machines in support of humans. So if I think of the first, there are things like training that is emerging as a real skill set in this intersection point. Training AI. There's actually explaining what the AI algorithm produced as an end result back to people that wanted to know what happened within that little sort of black box of AI algorithms that occurred. And they're sustaining those AI technologies. That's really human-led activities. On the technology side, there are things like amplifying the insight and analytics that humans have to provide better information to them. There's interacting, the ability of humans to interact in a more seamless way with customers as a result of as a result of technology. I was working with a retailer that's looking to introduce artificial intelligence to their field force so that when someone arrived at your home, they'd have deep understanding of what you had purchased through that retailer so that they could then determine how might they supplement what you've already got in your home as far as the next wave of intelligent technologies for your home. And lastly, there's embodying. We're starting to see in certain sectors how machines are really starting to come alongside lifting heavy objects, all of that type of thing. So this intersection point really becomes important for us to consider. But as you look at the evolution of human and machine interaction, I mean, we start in the pre-industrial era where we really had machine-like humans. And from an Accenture perspective, and we don't mean to have rose-colored lenses as we look at this challenge, because it is a very severe challenge that we're facing into, we do believe that as we've moved through the eras and finally find ourselves in the experience era, where machine intelligence amplifies humans, that we are going to see this role of humans in the workforce really strengthen. And as we've looked at research for both this piece of content and several of other pieces of content that we've recently released, in interviewing 1,500 executives, the overwhelming majority of them felt that the wave of technology growth that they're seeing in their organizations will have a net positive impact on the workforce. However, I think a lot of the conversation around this topic has revolved around this being this binary situation of we've got humans, we've got machines, and machines are coming to take the jobs of humans. And in reality, what I think we're really going to see is this augmentation of the human work that is going to slice off sort of 10% of a human's work, 20%, and that's going to leave the need to reconfigure the work that remains, as opposed to these broad sweeping statements that an entire job is going to move and go away. So I think that is really an important factor to think about. If 90%, which is what our research with Aspen identified, 90% of workers' work is going to be touched by automation and AI over the next several years. If 90% is going to be touched, and we see the majority of that not just moving away, but really that missing middle, what are the skill sets that then become important for that missing middle skill set to start to develop? And this is where I think the academic institutions really come into their own in helping us solve this problem, because a lot of the skill sets that are missing are more of the human-centric skill sets. Things like creativity, complex reasoning, social and emotional intelligence. But if you look at the academic curricula, often what you'll find is some of those courses are more aligned to your humanities, and some of the analytics and deep STEM skill sets are aligned to the STEM courses. And what we're starting to realize is that the individual and the skill sets at the individual level, not at the institutional macro level, really are important. And what we mean by that is we're starting to see this convergence of a single human being, a single person in the nursing sector or in the engineering sector, having to blend far more of these skill sets in their day-to-day interactions than ever before. And so that becomes really important for us to figure out how do we actually close that gap. So part of what the research did was it took the basis of research that was conducted by Accenture's Chief Technology Officer, Paul Doherty, to really look at some of what they identified as fusion skills. So these new skills that are emerging as intelligent technology and human ingenuity come together, and identified what are those fusion skills firstly, what is only human only, what is machine only, etc. So what this research did, it was built on that, and then really broke down those fusion skills and said, what are the attributes of that skill set that need to be true, and then reconfigured those into intelligences, and then really mapped those as what are dominant, what are basic, to really start to inform training curricula, start to inform who might you pair together on a team in your work environment, to really ensure that as we move forward, we've got the skill sets that we require in our workforces to actually do the work that's needed. So where this all comes back to, and I'll wrap with 2 more slides and then we'll move into the Q&A, is what is the next sort of thought process around how organizations can take some of this and start to do something with it. So firstly, on the mutual readiness side, I think it's important to note that change is here, and really thinking about how we prepare for that change becomes critical. My observation in a lot of the interactions that I have with our clients is that we do have this perspective that is quarter by quarter perspective, and it's not everywhere, but I think what that breeds is a time horizon that's not long enough in the future to really prepare for some of these macro shifts that are emerging. So if I take some of the work that we've recently done with AT&T, and we just launched an incredible joint initiative with them in the city of St. Louis, in 2013, they started to look out to 2020 to say, what's their workforce 2020 need to look like? And that was moving an entire workforce from sort of landlines to a massive data-intensive mobile digital business that they had. They've incredibly successfully reskilled and new-skilled, we like to say, their employees, and the majority of their employees have been new-skilled for the future of work at AT&T without them having to really look at massive displacement of workers in that scenario. But it required a 7 to 10 year horizon on this workforce challenge than a quarter by quarter or year by year or 3-year time horizon. So I think that's important as we think of this mutual readiness topic. The acceleratability, I think we are starting to see technologies, and it's certainly one of the trends we're observing around lifelong learning that is really supporting access to learning for workers. However, back in 1979, the average worker received 2.5 weeks of training in their average life. How long do you think the average worker receives in 2018? 11 hours. So I think there is this need around ensuring that we accelerate the ability to also, and it was part of the topic that Peter was talking about, how do we build the accounting system and mechanisms to incent some of the investment that's going to be needed in the type of new skilling that's required. And so this accelerated ability, I think, is in part how we digitize content and make it more accessible to people, but in part has some fairly structural parameters that are holding back some of the levers that organizations need to be thinking about. And then last, shared value. How do we really start to paint that picture with the workforce of shared value in this journey that we're embarking on? And certainly AT&T has succeeded in really painting a picture, but also opening up some mechanisms for access to learning that has truly been a shared value proposition for their workers. Accenture's done similar work with 180,000 of our IT professionals and new skilling them for the digital era. So this becomes, I think, a part of the thought process around where do we start as far as addressing this challenge is concerned. And then lastly, I think it was said in one of the panels that I sat in on, that it's important to recognize that as we address this missing middle and the skill sets required, there is a corporate responsibility for the corporations and leaders of those corporations to take a step forward in how they're thinking about this. And there's also responsibility on the individual to take a step forward and really think about how could they think differently about, how do they apply more of a curiosity to this concept of lifelong learning as opposed to being embedded in a job for life, so to speak. And so this need to meet in the middle and ensure that more than just one part of the puzzle is trying to solve the whole, I think is really important. And it goes beyond just the corporation and the employee. It goes to academia and society as well to really lean in and help figure out what we're facing here. So that's the research in a nutshell. We'll open up now to the Q&A part of lunch.
Great, yeah. All right.
Thank you, Denise.
Great, so I'm going to open up with some questions to these folks for just a few minutes, and then we'll open up to all of you as well. And I will try and be mindful of the trains continuing to run more or less on time. So good. So Nicholas, thank you for that. I guess this maybe is directed to you and Eva mainly, because it's sort of on the core of the research. And Miguel, and we'll come to you on some stuff. So you made clear you don't think that robots are going to eat all of our jobs. That, as you put it, machine intelligence is going to increasingly amplify humans and what we all do at work. Can you take us down a level? I mean, you use this mnemonic, and your colleague Paul has this mnemonic of trainers, explainers, sustainers. What does that mean? What kind of jobs are we talking about being created? What are some of the more common jobs and tasks actually look like? What are people doing in this new world?
So, I mean, on the training front, we're seeing, if you look at a fundamental level at where AI is starting to show up in corporations, a lot of it is in the recruiting process. And what is starting to be uncovered is the fundamental way that AI algorithm has been trained has a significant impact on the candidates who make it through to the next screening process. And so where the AI hasn't been trained effectively, there is bias and significant bias that's introduced into the entire recruiting process right from the source of the AI algorithm that was created. So when we talk about training, we're talking about humans training that AI algorithm to eliminate that bias, but that requires a human intervention to train. On the explaining front, there is a lot more application that we're starting to see where industries that have returned a verdict on your home mortgage request are actually being forced to explain what rationale that organization and entity went through to feed back out that determination. And that requires humans to look at how that algorithm calculated its decision and really explain that back out to community. And it's not just one or two jobs. There are significant jobs that we're starting to see emerge in these places. So those are a couple, Rick, that come to mind.
Anything you want to add there?
Well, thank you. And by the way, it's great to be here. Ari mentioned I have worn 3 hats. I was an employer for, got a little bit of feedback, for 35 years in consumer and technology companies. And then I left corporate America to serve Aspen-Accenture as the Vice Chairman of Skills for America's Future, and serve on 3 technology boards, first woman on 2 of those boards, and I have the honor now of leading Accenture's talent and org practice. So I like to tease and say I am either part of a 3-part solution or there's no way to blame any one part of the factor, employer, academia, or our conveners. But one, that's really tangible, Rick, and I like to be very practical because I've, worked in consumer businesses, is think of a study we did with Harvard, and it's, Breast Wellness Month, et cetera, with radiologists, highly skilled workers looking at exams. The simple study showed that with augmentation, not replacing the extraordinary skills, but that 130,000 cases that would have been underdiagnosed, so in other words, not caught it early enough to have the best possible patient outcome, with the augmentation of the human radiology capability were now identified. What the study showed then is radiologists were human. We get tired, right? And you do not want to have a mammogram reviewed between 4:30 and 5:15 on any day in our human capacity, right? And so the idea now that radiologist is not scanning for the 99% that have no issue, they're going to laser focus on the handful that are exceptional, that show a predictive pattern, and that they can spend time on patient care knowledge. So back to the whole training, explaining, sustaining, their job changed overnight to a much more augmented, interesting, high scientific application of their human-only skills of judgment.
And I wonder for really all of you, when I hear this, I think that sounds great, and particularly for that kind of job. Nicholas, some of what you described sounds more, frankly, at kind of the higher end of the labor market, where machines really can, work hand in glove with somebody. And yes, I might need some new skills, and I might need to bring out my human creativity and emotional intelligence and help the machine. But it doesn't sound like a lot of low-skill workers could easily slip into, trainer, explainer, sustainer jobs. Or am I missing something? Because I think it's that 80% in the middle, as we talked about today. What happens to them? That doesn't sound as easy.
I think you're absolutely right. I think this is where sort of how AT&T has thought about it, the time horizon that they've applied to their workforce shift. But even in the retail domain, we're seeing a lot of retailers looking at what are the pathways of jobs that are at bigger risk, and what might new work look like for those employees at that lower level. So if you take a checkout lane, well, a lot of the skill set that people have acquired in that job are now being looked at. Could these people fulfill an online order and pack the grocery bag and then put it in your car as you pull into the checkout lane? And so these are some of the jobs that are emerging that have that closer proximity to skill set that people have acquired through their sort of prior work in certain sectors. And so I think what this requires is that perspective and that longer time horizon on where is this future of work headed and how do we transition a workforce to that future of work. The other point I'll quickly make is I think some organizations are very seriously looking at how do they self-regulate in certain areas. So just because it might be possible to fully automate a certain factory or a certain plant, does that make sense for their reputation, their brand, their core values, all of those things that have been built over decades and decades of a lot of companies being in existence? Is it worth the risk of that brand by moving forward with something that's going to be very draconian for a certain community? And certainly the conversations that I've been in have not been as binary as this is a cost play, we're going to move forward and just do it. There has been a very strong perspective applied on we're actually going to self-regulate ourselves in certain scenarios because it would have a bigger impact on certain communities than others.
Do you want to add there? Yeah.
Well, it's that question is interesting to me. In the interviews that we were doing for the research, we spoke with someone at a pretty large financial institution, and one of the things they pointed out was that finance and insurance are going to be completely transformed by AI. And these jobs that are currently considered probably high-skilled jobs, MBAs go into some of these jobs. I mean, a bot is well capable of calculating very accurately discounted cash flows. You know, so there are certain skills that are held in very high esteem right now that come from business schools that are also going to be transformed in pretty significant ways. And I wonder, and this is probably naive of me, but I wonder if that's an untapped opportunity to actually start building more empathy between higher skilled and lower skilled workers, because this feels like a transition that's a bit unique in that a technological transition that's a bit unique that will impact higher and medium skill folks in ways that are not necessarily going to be comfortable for them.
That's interesting. Yeah, and if not empathy, at least maybe some protections that people with more voice and more power can build in for themselves, and may be able to help more of the middle would be nice. So you made clear this has got to be kind of a two-way street, that as individuals we all have an obligation toward lifelong learning, to reskilling ourselves to prepare for this new age, and that of course also employers have a major obligation in this, and you know, I would think we would agree all sectors do in helping through this transition. But to stick with the employer side for just a minute here, and there's some great examples. AT&T is one that's often cited. You know, Walmart's doing a lot in this space. There are others we could name, but they really are exceptional. I mean, you know, Capelli's work has been cited a bunch, but I mean, it makes it pretty clear. I think he put it succinctly in the breakout session I was on, is that, you know, employer-provided and employer-sponsored training has basically dropped like a stone over, you know, the last several decades. And so, I mean, are you confident that employers are really going to put the investment and resources necessary to prepare this missing middle, particularly to prepare, frankly, the front line, maybe those with less power and voice, workers who are going to need to be reskilled, upskilled, whatever term you want to use, especially when we are in an age where there is so much focus on shareholder primacy and efficiency, or whatever you want to call it, you know, and that can look like a short-term cost. The payoff may not come for a while. Why do we think any of this is actually going to happen in a good way?
You know, we were talking a little bit about how does change happen and when do you know when you're in it. We often call it in Silicon Valley the boiled frog syndrome, right? So one thing we saw, to use a bit of math, Rick, is that at Davos this year we produced a report, Reworking the Revolution, and we actually looked at who are the early adopters and self-identified the percentage of workers that want to receive advanced training. We looked at multi-skilled, multi-generation population, and then what employers are actually planning to invest. And there's a disconnect. The number was 3%. What I'm really happy to tell you, and this is back to why we're here together, is that the really early adopters are starting to move. And I think this will be one of the greatest inflection points as we look back 20 years from now, and why are they moving? I often talked as a chief HR officer, you can either pull people or push people. You know, Sean and I did a lot of work on vendor code of conduct in the supply chain, but the really sharp employers, Rick, have three political or contextual experiences. One, they can't fill jobs. Two, a lot of them can't tap the traditional talent pools they used to use with all the visa and immigration dialogue. And then the third thing is they've got to actually better know their own workforce. So this is where I'm so happy to have my academic colleagues, because the reality is we are now seeing a flood of enlightened board directors, CEOs, chief HR officers, and chief learning officers saying, if I have a workforce, at Gap I had 320,000 people. Do I know the raw skill level of those 320,000? How many of them could be merchants? How many of them can be store leaders? Most CHROs will tell you they don't know. And so what the AT&Ts, the Walmarts, and the others are doing, they're working with academia, and we have an unbelievable partnership with MIT right now, where we are doing breakthrough work on how do you know what someone's raw cognitive skill is? What would happen if you put accelerated investment in, so we call it accelerated ability, and then what are the productivity returns you get by any math that Peter Campelli can develop for us? Boards care about that, right? So I'm now working at the board and CEO level on three problems over and over again: talent, transformation, and technology enablement. And I sat with Wall Street CEOs not too long ago, and they said, I can get all the capital I need. There is one thing that I cannot get without doing things differently. It's the talent I need for cybersecurity, for the work on advanced data and algorithms, and frankly, all that talent supply is in this room. So, you know, how many of us are using virtual reality in our classrooms with our students? I teach at Cornell. We have great labs. We're not fully there yet. So 3%'s got to go to 30% really fast.
Yeah, and just to be clear, and so everyone understands, so that Accenture Research, if you're not familiar with it, it was 1,200 CEOs and senior executives surveyed. 74%, I think, so nearly 3/4 said that they plan to introduce AI or automation into their organizations in a big way in the coming years, but only 3% said that they were investing in training their workforce to cope with these changes.
And that was January of 18. We'll see what it looks like in 19.
That was so 2018, you know, we're good now.
It's going fast.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Miguel,
Rick,
do you buy that? I mean, from your, you know, coming from a world that looks a lot at the effects of shareholder primacy, the impetus, again, for kind of maybe a shorter term mindset, do you buy that gap's going to get closed?
I buy that it'll get closed some.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
But I'm unsure. I mean, it's when we entered into even thinking about AI, Aspen, we don't really have a big stake in AI per se. We thought it was a really interesting window into time horizon. This is a huge disruption, and it's a really interesting window into how management is thinking long term, or to what extent they are. But one of our fears is what happens when AI meets short-termism. Like, that's a disaster scenario for us economically, because algorithms can really ramp up some bad stuff. So I'm not totally sure. I think this represents a massive opportunity, an opportunity for business to kind of rethink embedded mindsets. I mean, people are treating AI as a true revolution, and if business takes that on as a true revolution, I think we will see some real fundamental rethinking of how we approach workers, how we approach job design, these choice points about how we approach hiring. that's the opportunity. But and I just don't know yet. I feel like we're at the stage where I hesitate to make predictions, but the opportunity is there, and it would be a huge wasted opportunity if we don't see some real fundamental rethinking.
Great. Let me, before I open up, I'm just ask one more to all of you. Maybe I'll stick with you to start and then go down and curious what you think. So we're sitting in a business school. There are many academics in the group here. So I'm curious what you think business schools need to do differently to prepare future leaders to effectively manage for the missing middle.
Well, I mean, the research is pretty clear that some real human skills are kind of where the action is at. For the future. And so I do think that there's a pretty substantial shift just in terms of the food chain, in terms of what's celebrated and valued in business schools as important skills. I think this is a really great opportunity to emphasize and finally understand that value creation is not just money plus technology equals value creation. That there's the human dimension in there is a critical pillar, and most of it comes down to execution, and humans execute this stuff. Otherwise, we're just leaving a ton of opportunity on the table. So I think for business schools, I think there's just a really remarkable opportunity to revisit how we view workers and human beings who create value and rethink that kind of equation.
Mm-hmm. And Nicholas, let me ask you with a little more of a pointed question to it, which is you had a long list of skills that you showed that we're going to need around emotional intelligence and creativity all to be drawn out. Are there a few that you would focus on? And again, if you were preparing future business leaders to focus on, right, focus is so important in business, which ones or two or should they off the list really?
I think one skill that is going to be important both at a sort of enterprise level and also at an individual level is the skill of curiosity or the appetite for curiosity. I think that sounds simple, and I think some of the soft skills, as it turns out, are actually pretty hard to build, especially in a very short time horizon. So I think we've got to start to entrench cultures of curiosity and figure out within enterprises how do we incent that curious nature, because that is a premise upon which a lot of this is based, that people will have the appetite and the desire to continue to learn. If people dig in their heels, that's going to be a very different scenario for us to face into. And the second is, I've seen it in some of these conversations that are starting to emerge around self-regulation, is what the research calls moral intelligence. And I think at a more macro level, more of an enterprise level, that is going to be a very important trait to start to emerge in enterprises around regulate or be regulated. How do they think about their role in self-regulation, and how far are they willing to push something before they take their foot off the pedal? And so I think that moral intelligence is going to be a new trait and a new skill set to nurture in some cases, and I think it needs to start pretty quickly.
That's great. Eva, what do you think?
I think there's three opportunities: supply side, the demand side, and the societal side. And that's why I'm really glad we're here together. If you think of the supply side for a second, we've been talking a lot today about words like loyalty, and we've been talking about connectedness, and we've been talking about economic value. A lot of the millennials I teach at Cornell look at me and they say, wow, for somebody that graduated in 1980, you've had 8 jobs. I'm going to have 8 jobs. Maybe I'm going to have 11. So their economic frameworks that 17-year-olds are talking to me about are things like agility, resiliency. They ask me questions about, how do I create my own brand? How does my brand have portability for the academic and lifelong learning skills? They talk about automation resilience, right? And these are the best and brightest in the world that we're producing. And so many of them, when they chat with me, and I'll use an example, Stanford GSB, 150 students. I said, raise your hands, how many are going to XYZ? 148 of the 150 startups. Why? Because this idea of, you know, I'll invest this extraordinary front-end loaded, you know, high capability with an extraordinary high return on investment to my lifelong capability that I can then go on to do X. So help me with the supply, because I actually think there are brand new frameworks with our students. We know 65% of all the students starting first grade this year will be in jobs that don't exist today. Some numbers with academics tell me it's 85%. The second one, though, is economic value, and Peter was so spot on. We were on campus, we've determined, at Cornell and overlap for a couple of years, but a lot of the things I was taught and that we talk about at Drucker are still the prevailing economic value metrics of chief HR officers and boards. We need some new ones. So I'm passionate about the return on investment on learning and capability building, and many individuals are taking it upon themselves. They're like, I'm not going to wait. I'm going to badge myself. I will take my degree from MIT, but now I'm going to show 5 certifications, you know, 3 startup experiences, and I want it to be portable. And it's particularly important in other countries. So in China, I learned that when I opened Gap in China, if I didn't spread my training every 6 months with a credential, people would come, do the first training, quit. So I had to create a pathway of every 6 months you get a new credential that's market viable to drive a 30% increase in your desired comp. The last one, though, and you touched on it, Nicholas, and I think this is the only group that can solve it, is the moral gray zone. And yesterday, I believe it was Tim Cook, talked about this whole question of radical transparency. I sat with 23andMe CEO, and when we were first doing the work about if you could tell someone that they have genetic codes of strong predisposition to serious illness, should you tell them? What level of preparedness for a human being to receive, you know, that kind of data? And she talked about the early days of deciding what to reveal, how to reveal it. You know, the FDA stepped in and shut her down for a few years. And then just last year, I heard her speak again, and she said, everyone said, well, what happened with all that drama? And she said, we still have people self-requesting, you know, do I have Alzheimer's, do I have a likelihood of Parkinson's, et cetera. But now they typically go to their doctor. And it's the drama of it, because it's been sorted out, is it's a person's choice. So I want to go back and ask our academic colleagues to help us with the moral gray zone. We know more about each other and our digital footprints than we've ever known in human history. As consumers, when we're all surfing at 1 a.m. and 5 cookies pop up to sell you things that you might have bought in the last month, we know, Nicholas and I, that these are our digital consumerism footprints. We have the same info as workers and humans. We need academia and society to step in with new frameworks of who has that data, who should control that data, when should you know when your data is being used? And GDPR out of Europe is the first entree into that. What will it look like 10 years from now? And what if academia turned their attention to this and said there are 5 societal questions about the use of one's digital footprint that crosses all geography and boundaries? We need each other.
For sure. And in the spirit of we need each other, let's open it up to all of you. And in the spirit of curiosity. So questions for the panel?
And Jim, it's nice
comments.
to see you back there.
Questions, comments?
Say hi to Jim.
We have stunned you into silence. Yes.
Hi, I'm Meg. Is this working?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm Megan. I'm a recent MBA grad, and I now work at McKinsey. It's one thing to talk about the employer-employee relationship when it comes to skilling. I'm wondering from your conversations with executives if you're seeing any appetite or have identified any pathways for workforce, like a broader ecosystem approach to skill shifts, occupation shifts. Like what role does business have in that larger conversation as opposed to just developing talent for one's own competitive advantage in the company?
Well, you know, Megan, I think you're touching on an incredibly important point. I just came from St. Louis yesterday, and it hasn't come up today, so I'll just throw it on the table of who owns an ecosystem of capability. When I sit with board directors and they talk about the pull strategy, which is I've got to shift my workforce, you know, we often talk about Accenture. We train 200,000 people in less than 36 months. because we saw the shift required, and we didn't have a single layoff. And we could spend a lot of time on that, but I'm using that as a surrogate to say in St. Louis, we have 0 unemployment in high skill areas, and we have 24% in the promise zone with 200,000 people facing really tough challenges from incarceration, opioid addiction. What we're starting to see, and that's why we're so excited about the partnership with Miguel, is that people are looking at enterprise shifts, like the Accenture example of, this is what our clients demand, we have to get ahead of it, let's go to MIT. And what we learned from MIT is we learned that the brand new science of adult learning, neuroscience indicators, have to be brought into our human work systems. And we could spend time on that. But we're also seeing public-private partnerships that are community-based have to change community ecosystems. Back to the point you were making, Nicholas, about if you're going to have a mine shut down and a factory open up, can those workers make the shift? So Rick and I are particularly passionate. Aspen announced on Monday with Maureen's leadership that they're doing 4 community-based initiatives. I think Chicago's kicking off. We've kicked off in London and St. Louis. You've kicked off in South Bend, Indiana. So Megan, I think the big news is that CEOs and boards want to shift their own ecosystem. Sometimes they want to affect their industry. But a lot of us are also saying, what's the community base? Because ultimately we all live somewhere. And our dollars and our families and our kids are trained and employed in those communities. And if we have urban areas with severe crime, it was said so well, and we can't get that kid in a wheelchair to his school or her school. Nobody cares, right? Because that kid's not going to learn. And Rick, I know you know a lot about this.
Go ahead.
I just add something because Accenture has some other survey research that's really interesting that shows that workers are really willing to lean in to reskilling themselves, but there are barriers. And as far as what companies can do, they can start removing some of those barriers, and some of those barriers are just time. Support, and in some cases, helping to pay for this stuff. But that to me is a part of the ecosystem that we really need to pay attention to, because workers are seemingly willing and eager to lean into this. And so to the extent that business can get smarter about that and understand their workers and their desires for training better, I think we'd make a lot of progress.
And I think it goes to an organization really having to look at a lot more than just a single thing. So if I was speaking to a client recently that has 197,000 employees, and they have 97,000 job descriptions in their organization for the 197,000 employees, which I thought was partly humorous. And then I realized that that actually becomes a real inhibitor to a lot of the agility that organization needs to start building. Because as we start looking at breaking down barriers, what's required is a little bit more clarity and transparency around career paths. But if you've got 97,000 job descriptions and you're trying to explain career paths to someone who's in one of the 97,000 jobs, it becomes almost an impossible task. And so I think there's some fundamental, really sort of roll up the sleeves and start to look at how do we simplify how we think of the organization in order to enable some of this new skilling that's going to start to emerge, because otherwise it's going to be just a nightmare.
Absolutely, yes. Go here and then here, and then maybe we'll close out to make sure we're on time. So we'll do 2 more. Yeah.
Great. So John Denniston, I've spent my career in Silicon Valley, love the panel discussion. Let me throw 2 things at the panel and get your reaction. The first is maybe AI is happening much faster than any of us think. And the second is China will determine how the workplace is affected, not America. So there was a book published, I'm stealing these thoughts from Kai-Fu Lee, who published last month a book, which is mandatory reading, I think, for this topic of AI, called AI Superpowers. Kai-Fu Lee is considered one of the foremost inventors of AI in the world. And what he teaches in his book is there was an invention 5 years ago by Geoffrey Hinton that made deep learning, machine learning, 3-dimensional. Makes it combinatorial. And now that's being deployed. And there's one city in China. China has now a public-private basically state-owned companies investing billions of dollars to win in AI. One city, Nanjing, in the next 3 years will invest $450 million itself. One. And not near the largest city. And then the larger cities are doing more. And so there's a tsunami wave building. So maybe we should have AI experts, in this discussion to inform us of the technology. And the second, what about China?
Yeah. Well, I'll use an analogy from the Bay Area to start my thought process off, and that is I used to live in the Bay Area, and one of the comments that you'd hear often is San Francisco doesn't receive enough big earthquakes to really be prepared for the really big one. So they compare it to Japan that receives quite a few, 5, 6, 7 earthquakes, which really keeps its preparedness system alert and thinking about how to continue to advance and strengthen that. I think what we're seeing in organizations where there is a very clear, distinct situation emerging where a significant portion of the workforce is going to be disrupted by AI or automation, we're seeing them make the early moves. But there are a lot of 4.2, 3.8 earthquake organizations out there that are going to see a significant portion of their workforce receive sort of 10, 20% of their work shift toward more of AI automation that aren't thinking enough yet about how to reconfigure that work. And so how do you start moving from workforce planning to work planning? The topic of China, I think, is it's always out there. But I mean, what organizations today are looking at is how do they look at the transformation of their workforce, here and now with the available technology that they have.
And I'd just only supplement real quick to say India. I just was in Bangalore and Mumbai 2 weeks ago, and early presentation of some of this research. Back to human modeling and human capacity, we know real simply, I've been in the Valley myself since the 80s, we're short 1.5 million cybersecurity engineers today, right now. We're producing 10,000. So back to, this isn't conceptual, this isn't 2030. These are phenomenal jobs, right? And they could give access to hidden talent pools like women in technology. I wanted to thank Megan and McKinsey. They released the October report with Lean In. Women aren't moving. So back to the point of where are there superpowers that are seeing untapped economic opportunity? China, spot on. I was incredibly impressed with our discussion. In terms of how do we do human modeling in Singapore, in Germany, in India around our academic systems, and how do we have people who are beginning to signal these market shifts help with our academic learning models so 1.5 million people are produced somewhere in the ecosystem that have raw skills that are high paying, that are equal, that are opportunistic to various talent pools so that we can go get those good jobs. I'm not working on those councils right here. Maureen and I are trying. Our business to society team at Aspen's trying, but Rick, you and I aren't getting called every day saying we want to do economic modeling for 10 million good jobs that are going to show up.
That's great. Let's go, Alison, let's go here, and then, and then last one, and then, I think we probably need to wind it down. So go ahead.
So I'm Alison Q. I'm from the University of Virginia.
There you go.
I'm from the University of Virginia. And I was really interested in your presentation on skills and the future of skills. And I started to wonder, what is the cost of viewing these as skills instead of thinking of businesses as creating kind of ecologies of interaction that might bring meaning to particular, between humans, and kind of when we think of them just as individual attributes that humans walk around with, as opposed to kind of moments of interaction. And then I was thinking, really the future, if not the present, is of fewer and fewer moments of human-to-human interaction, and perhaps revaluing or restructuring those so they deliver more meaning to their participants. And I was thinking, excuse me, this is for my teaching, which and I was thinking in your kind of sequence of, humans as machines, when we think about our social emotional skills, we are still, for a lot of human-to-human interaction, kind of making humans into machines in terms of the canned nature of some of the scripts that we force some customer service workers, et cetera, who are employed in human-to-human interaction. We're not treating those as kind of unique, shrinking opportunities for meaning. And so what would it look like for businesses to think less about these individual skill attributes and more like these ecologies that they're producing for people to interact? It strikes me that would have value both for their workers and for their customers.
Yeah, and it actually was the discussion that I was having with the CHRO of the life sciences company yesterday was revolved around that. And the conversation was, how does he think about taking very consumer-grade customer experience frameworks and models that they've created as a company and turn it inward to create more of those human experiences that really delight workers that show up to work. And especially where you have a certain workforce, 1 in 5 college graduates want to work for a Fortune 500 company. That was from our last research that we did from our college graduate study of 2017. So 1 in 5 want to work for a large organization. Where are the other 4 in 5 going? And how do the larger organizations create that culture which does nurture some more of that human-to-human interaction that people may find in a smaller environment that they actually crave to the extent that 4 in 5 of them are going there as opposed to 1 in 5 going to a larger organization. And so I think you're spot on. I think that thought process around the employee experience, creating moments that matter along their journey in an organization and their career sort of arc, I think is really an important consideration.
Great. Well, thanks to our panelists very much for a great conversation. And
Thank you, Rick.
Jamie, back to you.
Sorry, we had one more question that was
I'm
really
sorry.
trying to get in.
Yeah,
over here,
please.
so.
And I didn't.
And I'm the timekeeper, so.
Yeah. Okay.
do this.
Then we're good. All right.
Wow,
So
I feel
please.
a lot of pressure now.
Yeah, exactly.
My question was about the social emotional skills that we all know are going to become so important, but how do we make sure that isn't another way of sort of polarizing between those who have the four-year college degrees, have the opportunity to develop those skills? And did you all see in your research that employers are interested or willing to invest in making sure those who don't have four-year college degrees also can develop and continue to enhance those skills?
That's what I was trying to get at earlier, only that was a better way to ask the question. So, yeah.
I'll give a quick thought. MIT actually conducted a 12-month study of a factory where they focused on social critical thinking, curiosity, some of those types of skill sets. And they found that the return on investment from that training was significant, up to the tune of sort of 240% return on investment. So I think it still harkens back, though, to Peter's point around, does the enterprise actually are they still willing to make the trade-off of, I'm going to fork out this investment into training knowing that I'm going to get this return? And quite honestly, my experience is oftentimes that organizations still, even in the face of good, positive returns that they're going to get, opt not to take on the cost of the training because it still shows up as a line item of cost on the books. And so I think there's, again, sort of maybe looking to the academic community to help us start to structure some new models that would start to lean organizations toward seeing the return on investment as a real factor for them to take into consideration as they make these decisions.
And you're sitting next to Jim Jacobs, who I worked with on Skills for America's Future and activating this extraordinary community college ecosystem. I worked with Taco Bell workers and Gap Inc. workers, and I worked with research engineers and scientists at Sun. I loved our colleague who talked about home health workers. When you think about some of the mundane jobs being taken away, so for example, think of a nurse in a complex nursing unit. Now there is constant equipment monitoring that is telling her the condition of that patient. So one of the social and emotional is, how does she create empathy? And there's lots of great research, and again, this would be, outside the scope of our focus about that human interaction to the wellness of an individual who's critically ill versus, I gotta take your blood pressure, I gotta take your temperature, I gotta complete these 3 things, I gotta get them registered. We're seeing the same thing as Nicholas and I are doing some work on empathy and the experience in a consumer segment using virtual reality. So we're literally putting on an irate customer, you put on a virtual reality goggle headset and you respond. And you start getting feedback about the more empathetic and connected you are to that angry consumer, the better the outcome is. And so that instead of just, having, my customer letters went from, X 100,000 to 50,000, you literally can get a score. And back to academia and universities, a lot of this is being used in workers with a GED. They may have a 5th level education, and it's not exclusive to just the nurses or the radiologist. I think the greatest promise is frontline workers that are moving equipment, that are now using Kiva robots in a pick and pack center. It's changed their job overnight from lifting and moving boxes.
That's great. Well, good. Well, again, thanks to all of you. We can do a second round of clapping. I think that's in order. And Jamie, back to you.